viewers. Thank you for tuning in. Today we have with us Mr. Stephen Nichols, Director of Solution Engineering, NAM Acronis. Stephen, thank you so much for joining us here today.
Yeah, absolutely. Really looking forward to the conversation.
Likewise, Stephen. Thank you so much. So, Stephen, of late, there has been a renewed emphasis in the market on building a security first culture in companies, right? Security is no longer a checkbox that companies need to tick, but instead it has to be ingrained in the DNA of organizations, right? And the latest updates to the NIST Cybersecurity Framework has only reiterated this. And companies also sort of have a misconception that being compliant means being secure. That's not the case. Cybersecurity has to be prioritized as a core business strategy. Furthermore, as regulatory pressures and cyber insurance demands increase, companies must move beyond compliance to build resilient and proactive cybersecurity postures. So I was hoping to understand from you, how can MSPs and organizations lay the groundwork for such a culture, and what are the practical steps to ensure it becomes an ingrained part of their operations?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. I think it's really important for MSPs because, I think we've seen a shift in the culture within the MSP community to security first, but we're now in the process of, you're right, it's something that a lot of MSPs are struggling with. How do you get end users into the same mind frame? And I think there's a few things that can work really well. So first of all, it's about making sure that every conversation as an MSP that you have with your end customers has an element of security involved in that. Using a framework like the Cybersecurity Framework from NIST is also super valuable, because what it can do is it gives you a way to have a conversation where it's not about you as the MSP selling a solution or a piece of software to the end customer, but in fact what you're talking about is the security stance. And you can evaluate against each of those pillars where they currently are, where there may be gaps, and where there might be a strategy where you can make incremental changes. The other thing that is a practical solution that actually is starting to be almost required by insurance now is security awareness training. So security awareness training, particularly if it's compelling content, can really up that kind of security first mindset within end customers, because otherwise, maybe the IT department at that end customer is starting to get that security thinking, but that can add a huge difference into that. The other thing I would say is doing regular security assessments with your customers, right? So it's not a conversation you have once and forget about it. It's something you have quarterly or monthly.
Those were wonderful insights, Stephen. Thank you so much for sharing about that. And, as organizations work towards this security first approach, the need for integrated solutions becomes even more pressing, right? So how important is it to have interoperable tools within a cybersecurity strategy? And what advantages does this bring in creating a defense against today's complex threats?
Yeah, you know what? It is about a couple of things. So one, it's about the number of screens that technicians need to look at in order to understand when and where threats are coming from, but also how to respond to a threat afterwards. So having tools that are integrated reduces the number of screens that technician needs to look at. It also means that those tools aren't conflicting with each other. When they're configured to basically play nice with each other, you're now reducing the number of false positives. You're reducing the number of alerts that are showing up in different places. And it also means that when you're investigating, you have information which is both timely and accurate. And that's a huge importance when you're dealing, especially with complex threats. It's also important because if configured properly, those tools can support each other as opposed to conflicting with each other.
So, Stephen, now that we have the the integrated solutions part of it sorted, I'd like to go back to the first point that I mentioned, that compliance does not mean cybersecurity, right? And of late, there has been a strong push from regulatory bodies and cyber insurance providers for enhanced security standards. However, companies need to go beyond simply meeting these compliant requirements to build a proactive, resilient cybersecurity posture that evolves to evolving risks as well. So how can companies sort of do this?
Yeah, I've always said that if you're just meeting the minimum requirements, that from a compliance point of view or even from a cyber insurance point of view, you're doing the bare minimum. So from an analogy point of view, if you think about car safety, I think those regulations are the seatbelts and the airbags. So if you don't have them, you're in a lot of trouble. But if you actually look at what safety and security posture looks like, it's a lot more than seatbelt and airbags. And I think when we start looking at things from a framework point of view, as opposed to checking boxes, you end up with a proactive security posture. I'm a big fan of the NIST Cybersecurity Framework, but there's the CIS controls, there's lots of other frameworks out there. And but the nice thing about a framework is you don't necessarily have to be perfect in all the areas, but it gives you visibility. It helps you to understand where you are today and then what steps you can take. The other thing I like for MSPs about it is it changes the tone of the conversation. So it's not about, I'm trying to sell you this software, or you need to pay me this money to manage this particular thing. It's really about the overall posture of the security, and it's able to say, let's work together to improve this from where we are today, so that we can see 6 months from now or a year from now, we're going to be even more secure.
So again, Stephens, that was a very, very interesting point that you mentioned, right? And while we are talking about the overall cybersecurity posture, the latest trend has been remote work, right? So this has in turn led to the shift from perimeter security to endpoint and identity management. So how can organizations effectively protect user identities in the era of remote working?
Yeah, it's funny. I was asked a few days ago, or I guess a few weeks ago now, to think about what I thought the most interesting risks were going to be in 2025. And I definitely think that identity is one of those areas that is, as a community, we're still struggling to figure out some best practices. So, we started out a long time ago with kind of a fortress structure where you build a perimeter and you make it really hard to get into that perimeter. As you said, remote work is become prevalent, the work from home, work from anywhere strategy. And so then it became about the endpoint. But the endpoint itself, with whether that's with EDR, whether it's just with good policies and practices, the endpoint can start to be secured. The area where I think we're still evolving is in that identity protection, because we know that the vast majority of attacks start with an email. They start with phishing in particular. Whether that's social engineering. It might not even be a case where there's a malicious payload. It might not be a case where it's even taking you out to a site. But it's about, in breaking that trust, right? So it's about figuring out ways to get around. So there's a few things that I think MSPs can do, and I think end customers need to do. So first of all, it's something we've talked about already, that security first framework, kind of thinking about things from a security point of view. You want to make sure that you can still do business, but you need to be a little bit skeptical. If something isn't, if you get a request to send money that's kind of unusual, if you get a request that's really urgent, think about verifying that. And outside of that email chain, pick up the phone and call the person. As well, from an identity point of view, I think there are 3 actual steps that MSPs can take. First of all, you've got to have email security. Email is one of the most vulnerable places where things come in. That's where a lot of the phishing attacks come from. The second thing is that security awareness training that I talked about, because that helps to develop that security first mindset in all of the end users. And the third thing is making sure that your Active Directory or whatever system you're using is locked down and secure. It's about that zero trust. Making sure that people only have access to the things they need to do their job, and that there's proper policies, procedures in place to make sure that things are as secure as they possibly can. Microsoft's a great organization, but out of the box, 365 isn't secure. You can either harden that yourself by going in and doing all the settings, or you can go with a third-party solution that would help you to secure that. And then the other piece of that is making sure you have a really good way for visibility into unusual behavior. I think you've got to have EDR in place. You've got, especially now we're talking about XDR when it comes to identity. So it's looking at things like Entra ID, looking for, where are those changes that are coming in. And I think it is also about monitoring the settings on those mailboxes and looking for those anomalies.
So, Stephen, when you were mentioning email and being skeptical, one thing that has now changed is the introduction of AI, right? I mean, as an employee, when we were being asked to be skeptical about mails, one of the things that we were told was, take a look at the grammar, take a look at the capitalization. But AI has completely taken care of that. AI can sort of be a double-edged sword when it comes to cybersecurity as well, right? And these are very basic things that I'm talking about. I'm sure the threat actors are using AI for much more sophisticated attacks. So, with the prevalence of phishing attacks and the sophisticated use of AI by threat actors, what strategies can companies use to safeguard their most vulnerable entry points?
There's no question that the threat actors have figured out AI. You're right. There's, if you think back to the, early days of spam emails, you think about things like the Nigerian prince that's left you money, right? I think if most of us got those kind of emails today, we'd recognize them as, not a legitimate email. But today, they're going out and they're replicating the logon site for Microsoft. They are they're able to make sure that the grammar, the punctuation, it looks like a legitimate email. It's so hard for human eyes to be able to easily detect that. Now, if I was to give you two emails, one that's legitimate, one that's not, you could probably figure out which one. But the reality is when you've got an inbox that's full of a whole bunch of emails and you're just kind of processing them as part of your day, then it's much more likely that's going to slip through and you're going to click on something that you shouldn't. So there's definitely the use of AI and automation by MSPs is super important. So that means a good email security solution, one that's got AI like the one from Acronis that has the ability to detect those. And the only way that you can actually really detect those is by using AI against AI, because we're able to then look at things that the human eye might not be able to pick up. Whether that's for example, an uppercase I and a lowercase L look very, very similar in a URL, so it would be really easy to trick somebody. But that's not something that's going to trick an AI, that if every character has an ASCII code, that's what it's looking at. The other thing I think that is really important when I talk about being skeptical is if something feels a little bit off, trust your intuition and just verify it. If it is a legitimate email, reach out to that person, right? Whether connect them on Teams, reach them by phone to verify that they're actually requesting you to send that piece of information or money or whatever it is. And then the other thing I think is really important is to make sure that you have every device in your organization protected with EDR, right? It's not about just having a couple of devices, right? Anytime you have a weakness, that's what the threat actors are going to look to exploit. So making sure that you have an understanding, like we recently introduced Device Sense, which is the ability to be able to, within a network, detect all of the devices. So you can know what's not protected, and that gives you the same kind of visibility that threat actors are going to have, so that you can go in and then protect those devices.
That was fascinating, Stephen. Thank you so much for sharing that. And every conversation that we have about cybersecurity is never complete without discussing the backup aspect of it, right? So that's where I'm coming next. So finally, when it comes to ransomware and data protection, how does backup fit into this security narrative? And what role does integrated backup and security approach play in ensuring data resilience and recovery, particularly in high-stake incidents where swift response is crucial?
Yeah, a lot of I've heard a lot of people say basically, backup is dead, long live backup. The reality is that backup alone is not a strategy against ransomware, but it is still an important pillar in that strategy. So when you look, again, going back to that cybersecurity framework from NIST, when you look across all of those pillars, recovery is one of those pillars. And the reason for that, even if you were to pay the ransom, even if you were to have data that was encrypted, you were to pay the ransom, the reality is in today's landscape, threat actors are often what's called double encrypting. So what they're doing is they're taking your data, they're encrypting it, they're then running another encryption algorithm on top. On average, you lose about 10% to corruption when that happens. So having good backups is super important. The other thing, and it's kind of related to the backup strategy, and that's the business continuity strategy, that disaster recovery. What a lot of people don't think about, unless they've experienced an incident, is once you get the insurance or the law enforcement involved, they may seize some of those assets or have you freeze them so they can investigate. And one of the biggest downsides, one of the biggest risks to businesses where they've had an attack is the reputational damage. Because if you're offline for a period of time, it makes it really difficult for you to maintain your business. So being able to have those full system backups, be able to bring those up quickly in a disaster recovery, whether that's in the cloud, whether it's another local incident, but being able to have that so that you can have the business continuity, you can't do that without the backups. And the other thing is, in our integrated solutions, we have a natively integrated solution. We started in doing data protection, we added security, and as a result, everything really works well together. So when you're responding to an EDR incident, you have the ability to roll back the changes, but you also have the ability to fail over to the cloud. You have the ability to do a full recovery of that device. And when it comes to security, what we're really looking at is we're trying to secure the data, right? It's the information. That's the thing that has the most value, whether that's because of personally identifiable information, whether it's because it's got trade secrets, but it's really securing that information, both denying it to the people that you don't want to have it, but also making it available to the people that need it. And there's no question that both security and data protection are important to play together. The other piece that's kind of interesting is there are a lot of attacks that kind of try to protect themselves, right? So when their code is actively running on a system, it's doing things to not be detected. When you back that system up and then you scan that system when it's at rest, there is the ability to detect some of those threats that you might be more difficult to detect when they're active. So again, integration, the bringing together of all of those pieces, covering all of the pillars of the NIST Cybersecurity Framework is how you get a security stance and really make sure that you're properly protecting both the data as well as the endpoints themselves.
Thank you so much, Stephen. I must say it was a pleasure talking to you today. I mean, I, for one, have a much better understanding of what it takes to be to develop a security-first culture within an organization. And I'm sure the audience who's watching this interview will also have the same to say. It was an absolute pleasure chatting with you today. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Yeah, I definitely enjoyed it, and hopefully we can save some information or some endpoints out there from being attacked successfully.